Hello, welcome to CBHX History, and today we'll be telling some stories of soldiers that fought in the War of the Pacific, which was the geographically largest theater of World War II. We hope that this information gives you a new perspective on World War II and the different parts of it. It doesn't matter what your age is or how much you already know about World War II. We hope these stories will give you a new insight into the war in the Pacific. Lieutenant Arch Shilliday was attacking a Japanese position with his patrol. When he attacked, the only way he could have let his squadron know was by yelling to them, and they weren't able to hear him because of their distance to the patrol. The position's firepower was very strong, but his patrol was able to take it regardless. A witness of Shilliday's actions, Captain James, said that the lieutenant was done in half an hour, and only 3 of his men were injured, and they walked back to the squadron with energy left to spare. Captain James needed to reach the rest of the regiment to explain their perimeter around the Japanese to them. He asked Corporal Ham Morton and 2 other soldiers to go back to headquarters. They gave Morton the info about their stores, equipment, and info they had gained about the enemy and the area, and he left at 8 p.m. At 4 a.m., Morton arrived at the regimental headquarters without the 2 soldiers, sadly. When the corporal arrived at the headquarters, he was wounded in 3 different places, but he insisted on seeing the commanding officer to deliver the information before being treated. Because of his efforts, the regiment knew the way in between 2 Japanese perimeters to avoid further casualties. This story drew my attention because of the bravery of the soldiers and officers and what they did for their side of the war. I found it interesting because Shilliday was able to take a position in only half an hour, and while I'm sure it took other groups hours or even days to take similar territories.
My story is about Harry Bylett. He was born in Auckland, and in 1913, he worked as a journalist cadet for the Auckland Star. He then traveled overseas and was posted to Fiji with the 29th Battalion in 1941. Then, in 1942, he was posted to the New Caledonian with the 30th Battalion. Harry worked closely with U.S. troops at the time and worked mainly on commando raids to get info on Japanese troops. They would go into relatively small groups and cut their way through forests to scout out the Japanese. Sometimes they would go through well-worn tracks to make navigation easier, but this came with a risk. Harry pointed out that when you took these tracks, you never know if the Japanese are waiting for you at the end of the route. The work that Harry was doing was very dangerous because you never know if there are enemy troops waiting to ambush you. Then, in 1944, Harry moved back to New Zealand for medical reasons and injuries. This story was very inspiring for me because it showed me how many different lives were affected in World War II. It did not matter which country you were from or which assignment you had, the threat of death was all the same. Take this story for example. Harry went on commando raids, which is a very strategic job that let the commanders know how many Japanese they were up against. This was an important job, but also a dangerous one, because the threat of being attacked by the Japanese was high.
My story is about Mitsuo Fuchida, a Japanese pilot that took part in both Pearl Harbor and the Battle of Midway. He was born in Nara Prefecture, Japan, and joined the Japanese Navy in 1921, where he took an interest in flight. His first active deployment was in 1937 against the outdated Chinese aircraft, and had logged over 3,000 flight hours and been promoted, resulting in him being in command of an entire carrier division. When the attack on Pearl Harbor occurred, Mitsuo was leading the attack in an observation aircraft, and seeing that the Americans weren't mobilizing against him, he slid open his canopy and fired a flare, signaling for the attack to go ahead. During the battle, he assisted in sinking the USS Arizona, and in the process took 21 hits to his aircraft from AA guns positioned on the coast and on the American ships. After the war, Mitsuo returned to the United States as a member of the Worldwide Christian Missionary and declared himself an ambassador of peace. He eventually decided to live permanently in America, where he became a citizen and died in 1976. I thought this story was interesting because even though he fought against America in World War II, he still came back because of his religious beliefs and was able to put any resentment behind him.
Now we have James Fahey, a garbage truck driver who was in all 4 years of the war. James talks about how he joined the war so that he could fight not only for his country, but just for the sake of fighting. He talks about how he was on a ship heading towards the Japanese territory on the Solomon Islands. When they got to the islands, they were faced with a Japanese fortress, but they had a plan to bombard the Japanese with more troops that were south of their location. I thought this was a very smart plan because they were on enemy territory where they were at an immediate disadvantage since they had less troops, so their plan to attack from behind with more troops was really smart. The next and final entry I will be talking about is when he talks about the wounded troops. There were apparently 300 injured from the Japanese attacks, and many of them had lost their minds due to a lack of sleep. This just shows how hard of a battle it was against the Japanese. It also shows how, though you're fighting hard, you will sometimes find yourself in a very tough spot. This episode was made to show the different perspectives of the war in the Pacific. Make sure to subscribe so you don't miss episode 4, Genocide. You can also find in the description our resources for the stories, and the BBC World War II page, which contains even more stories from people who lived during World War II.